already, explaining where the concept came from, its meaning, summarising what needs to be done, and then moving on to how we do these assessments. So let's dive straight in. Some information on where it came from. I imagine some of you will be familiar with this, but sort of setting the scene as much as anything. So going not really way back, but going back to the 2015 Paris Agreement. Important to mention this. I think probably most people listening are going to be familiar with this. What did that say? So it was the agreement between 196 parties. It's a legally binding agreement on climate change. The agreed goal to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. So this is the sort of introduction of these concepts of where you hear all the time 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. This is the starting point. Also to mention nationally determined contributions. So these are how the country implements the agreement. So the NDC, the nationally determined contribution, is basically the country's contribution to climate action. It legally binds the country to do something, but exactly what is not defined. But what the country is going to do is set out in the NDC. So the important about this in net zero terms is the Paris Agreement did not use the phrase net zero. But in the NDCs that I've just sort of described, governments are starting to use the term net zero as part of these NDCs. So as part of the commitment that's come out of the Paris Agreement, it's sort of not really being translated, but it's being explained in a net zero target term. So this is one of the starting points. Also, the 2018 IPCC report. So this is another key part. So this warned slightly more strongly that emissions must not exceed 1.5 degrees to avoid the most catastrophic impacts. And to achieve this, so what I've got on the screen there, so this introduces a couple of key elements as well. So to prevent the temperature rising to 1.5 degrees, emissions need to fall by about 45% by 2030 and reaching net zero around 2050. So this is where the net zero term comes from. And we'll come back to these points and these dates. So 45% by 2030 sets an interim target. We'll talk about interim targets in more detail. And the net zero term is now here with that 2050 date. So that's the origin. So is there a definition of net zero? I mean, there isn't a sort of formal definition, but there's a couple of things again on the screen here. So to describe the concept in more detail. So greenhouse gases are reduced to a minimum, and any remaining emissions are removed. So there's another couple of key terms that we're going to come back to. So it's talking about reductions and then removals. The net zero might be fairly obvious. Means that the greenhouse gas emissions produced and the amount removed are equal. So there's a balance. This concept of the net, so there being this balance, is important because it would be difficult to reduce all emissions to zero. So that's sort of viewed as almost sort of simply being not possible, I guess. So it's about this balance, but it's really about these key phrases of reducing and then removing. So, I think again, probably everyone's familiar with the problem, but just a quick slide on this. So what's the problem again? So a couple of charts here. Apologies, one is slightly covered, but you basically have so this is the average surface temperature globally, and this on the black chart here is emissions. So yes, fairly obviously I've put an orange bar here around 1960, and it sort of, I suppose, states the obvious that temperature's going up as emissions are going up, and I think we probably will understand that. So we won't labour that point, but it was widely reported this week, I think it was Tuesday, that 2023 is virtually certain to be the world's warmest year on record. The previous one being 2016. So yes, like I said, we're probably all pretty familiar with that. So a similar chart, but this is temperature pathways, or sort of temperature pathways, showing various scenarios. If we do nothing, I'm not going to labour this one, but just very briefly, if we do nothing, applies a sort of 4-degree temperature rise. Current policies, if emissions reduce slightly, so we're coming up 2.5, 3 degrees. And ideally, so this is what we were talking about initially, the 2-degree and the 1.5 degree pathways. And these imply a significant reduction in emissions. So hopefully you can see the mouse. But so two things to focus on here. One of them is the left axis. So this is the actual greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons or billion tons. So focus on this. I think this number here, 50 billion tons a year. And then also sort of focusing on the shape of the curve, which I just lost the mouse. So I'm admitting someone into the lobby. So the shape of the curve here. So in the next couple of slides, we'll talk about this. So I want to introduce the concept of the carbon budget, which I will now endeavour to explain. So this is where the 50 gigatons a year is important in terms of the carbon budget. So carbon budget, the maximum amount of carbon that can be emitted to keep the temperature rise under a set amount. So if the set amount is 1.5 or 2 degrees, obviously a slightly different budget there. But we have to get this concept in our head. It's important in terms of interim targets and sort of total volume of carbon that can be reduced. So at that amount I mentioned, so 50 billion tons a year, there's some Imperial College analysis earlier, when it was October this year, that they said there was a tiny amount left, was how it was reported. 250 billion tons was the amount. I don't know if that's tiny, but in global terms, I think, yes, a very small amount, especially if you're emitting 50 billion tons a year or thereabouts. So with some reductions, that implies a need to get to net zero by 2034, which clearly isn't very far away, and but that's for a 1.5 degree temperature rise. So really sort of hammering home this point that something needs to be done. There are some, I don't want to go into the sort of technical details, but a lot of these numbers depend on this confidence level. So there's predictions and probabilities. If you, instead of 1.5 degrees, change to 2 degrees, and with a 66% confidence level of remaining under that temperature, that can be achieved with net zero by 2050. So there's quite a lot of sort of, if you use the term, I don't know if it's flexibility or sort of variation, even from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. But yes, the point being that I think we all understand that, again, something needs to be done. But so the point, perhaps the point I really want to make about the carbon budget, because this is very important for the net zero concept, is whether you're going over or under budget being very unlikely. But if you're emitting too much initially, the starting point here, you may get to net zero at the end, but along the way, you have basically emitted too much carbon. So you've gone over that budget. So if it's 250 billion tons remaining, or even 500 billion tons remaining, if you go over that, it doesn't matter in a way when you go over that. If you do go over that, then there's too much carbon in the atmosphere, and you're going to go over your temperature limit whenever that occurs. So one more chart on that, so just to try and hammer that point home. So this is where if you're over budget at the start, it implies, so for every year you're going over budget, you're going to have to go under budget at some point. Otherwise, all this carbon is then in the atmosphere. So even if you did that, and then it was, hopefully you can see the mouse, if you went over budget and then down the curve, you've still emitted too much. So even if you get to net zero at 2050, there's all of this carbon in the atmosphere that you didn't want there, just to stay under your temperature rise. So it implies you have to go under budget at some point, and the way things are going, that is incredibly unlikely. So it's a really key point, and we'll talk about interim targets. But this is sort of where they come from. That you have to have interim targets to stay on this line, so you don't go above. Okay, I hope that makes sense. You can fire a question in if not. So yes, so what needs to be done in a sort of mini summary? So this is sort of to stay on that line. So emissions must decline by 45% by 2030. So that did come out of the IPCC report. So that's your reduction, and they must reach net zero by 2050. So that would involve reduction, but also this concept of removals, which we'll come to later. And I've probably said it many times already, but the concept of interim targets. So there should be interim targets every 5 years to make sure things are on track and you're not going to go over budget. And there's a little stat there from the SBTi, the Science Based Targets Initiative. So their net zero standard, most companies in the world would need to reduce their emissions by 90 to 95% by 2050. So again, that hammers home the idea of reductions. So we'll explain a little bit more about that, talking about a little bit of terminology, about the difference between reductions and removals and offsets with the term carbon neutral. When we see some examples, you'll see some of the things that companies say that can be confused. They can use carbon neutral or net zero interchangeably. So let's try and explain the difference. So net zero focuses on reducing emissions to the lowest amount first, and then essentially offsetting as a last resort. So reduce first, then remove, and then offset as a last resort. Carbon neutrality, as it is generally described, is focused on offsetting. There's a bit more to it than that in some sort of definition, some place of looking at it. So the carbon trust, a net zero target must include scope 1, 2, and 3. And carbon neutrality can be a little bit more loose than that in terms of only requiring scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 is encouraged, but sort of not generally built in. I think at the moment the carbon trust I think the term was transitioning their carbon neutral verification to have a more focus on reductions, kind of for this reason. But that's sort of the essential difference. Net zero also should refer to all greenhouse gas emissions, ideally. And carbon neutral is obviously referring to carbon, but then we must sort of reflect or point out that for a lot of companies, probably most companies, their greenhouse gas emissions are in fact carbon. So for some there's methane and others, but the majority, I think we're talking about carbon. Okay, so a little chart coming up on the next slide to explain one of the issues with carbon neutrality. So the problem, hopefully this can illustrate, both of these charts, you have emissions, and so at the top and then the offset at the bottom. So both of these are carbon neutral. So this one is sort of business as usual, emissions increasing. So why can't you just sort of offset more and more the carbon, and that is carbon neutral? That's okay, isn't it? But the problem with that, I think one of the main was it assumes you can actually offset this much carbon. Talk about sort of methods a bit, but even if you're planting trees, is there enough land? I think the generally understood that there isn't. You can't just go on with the business as usual situation and offset by planting trees and using technology. So there has to be some reduction. So this is where when we start looking at companies and they say we're pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050, for example, or 2030, drilling down into what they're really saying. Do they mean carbon neutral? Or are they just offsetting? So this is where it becomes important. Okay, so let's we'll talk about. I've talked about reductions, but how do you do it? Again, I think probably most people are going to be fairly familiar with the overall concept. There's some easy switches, obviously switching out of fossil fuels to renewables, energy efficiency and reducing waste, and how energy is used. The bigger cuts that are going to be needed, so that's where it gets more difficult. Excuse me. So look at a long phrase there, but it basically means new technologies, investment and innovation into less fossil fuel intensive technologies, and focusing on key sectors. I suppose that's also fairly obvious. Sectors like heating, transport, agriculture, oil and gas is another obvious one, to get those bigger cuts that are needed. So that's that's a brief overview of what you can do about reductions. And then if we're talking about removals and offsetting, nature-based solutions, planting trees is probably the one most people think of or have heard of, increasing wetlands and land management changes. So this is all about increasing the amount of carbon sequestered into the soil. So a removal is, we talk about long-term locking up the carbon. That could be another difference with offsetting. And then technological solutions such as, well, the other phrase for this, negative emissions technology, which is a good one. But so, yeah, technological solutions such as carbon capture. There are other acronyms. There's direct air capture, DAC, bioenergy, and with carbon capture. So without going into the details of these, BECCS, and one of our examples companies is using these. So it all sounds good on paper, these technological solutions, but at the moment they're not being done on a large scale, and they can be expensive, and they can also be quite energy intensive in themselves. So at the moment, not quite the panacea that we need, or the significant shift that we need, but they are there and they're being invested in. So yeah, a little bit more about offsets, carbon credits, just briefly. Some of the problems with this, or one of the main problems, is that the credibility of some of the schemes is being questioned. So if you are just relying on offsets, particularly if it's planting the trees, are they really being planted? Are they growing as expected? And I also was reading about a scheme this week that was based on rather than planting trees, it was based on preventing deforestation. So if we don't cut down those trees, then sort of that's okay. That, well, it will help to offset carbon. But saying things like it's okay to fly more planes if we don't cut down those trees is kind of not the approach we're looking for, fairly obviously. So that the credibility of offsets as a method being questioned, and some of the standardization of how it's done and the terminology it can be a bit confusing and is still evolving with these methods. But having said all that, there is an argument that there's still a place for some offset, but it's minimizing it, as I've kind of alluded to. So there will always be residual emissions, so those that cannot be reduced or removed, and at that point, that's where offset could be coming in when you've done all the other work to reduce or remove as much as possible. Okay. So moving on, a little bit of summary of what I've just sort of run through fairly quickly. So you see a lot of sort of negative news about carbon, but the fact is that global emissions are not reducing quickly enough. So if you think back to the over budget curve, that's kind of where we're at. And it is true that instead of being on track to reduce emissions by 45%, they're actually still increasing and set to increase by 11%. On top of that, or alongside that, there's been an influx of net zero commitments. In terms of GDP, more than 90% of global GDP is now said to be committed to net zero. So that's talking about country commitments rather than company commitments. I think I have some stats about the number of companies if that question gets asked. And then just a final point there, at COP27, so the last COP, UN General Secretary called for zero tolerance on net zero greenwashing. So given the confusion and lack of credibility prevalent in corporate net zero pledges. So this is really the problem, and what we'll start looking at in the second part. It's very easy to make a commitment. It can almost be as simple as, of course, we'll be net zero by 2050. In a way, anyone could sort of say that, but it's how are you going to implement that? What's your plan? So that's what we'll look at in the second half. And even with countries, well, same with countries and companies, it's very easy to say, yeah, 2050 is obviously the target. We'll commit to that, but what or how are you going to do it?